Growing up, my parents' marriage was a constant storm of conflict. It was like one of those high school relationships where they'd clash, make up, then clash again, but instead of being able to walk away, they were stuck under the same roof. And so was I. From my earliest memories, I was surrounded by screaming, shouting, and sometimes even physical fights that broke out over the smallest disagreements. There was no stability, no sense of security in our home. The sounds of glass shattering or something heavy slamming against the wall were as familiar to me as the sound of a television in the background. As a child, I didn't understand why my parents were always angry. All I knew was that their fights terrified me. When I was young, I would cry, hoping they would see my fear and stop, but my cries only seemed to make things worse. They would turn their fury on me, yelling for me to be quiet, telling me to stop being dramatic. Eventually, I learned to stifle my feelings. I felt it was dangerous to express anything, even fear or sadness. And my parents, the very people who were supposed to protect me, had made me feel the most vulnerable. Over time, I developed ways to cope. I'd retreat to my room or lock myself in the bathroom, anywhere I could feel even a little bit safe. I'd bury my head under a pillow or plug in headphones, trying to drown out their fury. The fear never fully went away, but I managed. Things began to shift when my maternal grandparents stepped in. They'd quietly watched this cycle of conflict for years, but eventually, they'd had enough. They gathered the extended family and held an intervention, confronting my parents and urging them to get help. For the first time, it felt like someone saw how much my parents' relationship was hurting me. The intervention wasn't just about fixing their marriage, it was about rescuing me from an emotional hell. After some hesitation, my parents reluctantly agreed to attend marriage counseling. It wasn't an instant fix, but over time, they began to change. Their fights became less explosive, less frequent. It was as though they were learning to speak a new language, one that didn't involve anger or blame. For the first time in my life, our home grew quieter, and I dared to hope for a little peace. But as my parents grew closer to each other, I started to feel a strange distance forming between us. Before, they'd at least shown some involvement in my life. My mom would make breakfast, and my dad would drive me to school. Small gestures that felt like some form of care. But now they were so focused on their own healing that they stopped these little acts of parenting. My mom no longer bothered with breakfast, and my dad wouldn't give me rides to school, instead handing me money and telling me to figure things out on my own. Their newfound connection seemed to come at the expense of their connection to me. I felt forgotten, abandoned in this new dynamic. They went out on date nights, leaving me behind with leftovers to scrounge. They no longer asked about my grades or showed any interest in my life. Once, when I proudly mentioned a high grade, hoping for a glimmer of pride or praise, they barely acknowledged it before returning to their own conversation. My 15th birthday was the breaking point. I'd never been allowed to celebrate my birthday before, and I'd always just accepted it. But this year, I wanted something different. I wanted to feel like a normal teenager, to celebrate with my friends. So, I mustered the courage to ask for a small party. My dad dismissed it immediately, and my mom went a step further, telling me to stop asking for ways to waste their money. She said that instead of expecting more, I should start finding ways to pay them back for the money they'd already spent on me over the years. Her words hit me like a slap. I was furious. I couldn't contain it any longer. I shouted back, letting all the pent-up anger and hurt pour out. I told them that they'd never done anything to make me feel loved or cared for, that they'd only ever shown me resentment. My mother's reaction was swift and harsh. She slapped me across the face, a sting that was both physical and emotional. My dad just watched with a look of disappointment, telling me that I was acting childish and ungrateful. That night, I cried myself to sleep, feeling more alone than I ever had. I felt like a stranger in my own home. A week later, my dad called me into the living room. Both he and my mom sat there, looking serious. My heart pounded as I took a seat, expecting another round of scolding. Instead, my dad started talking about how their marriage had been improving, how they felt happier than they had in years. But then he paused, and his next words sent a chill down my spine. He said, "There's still one problem standing in the way of our happiness, one big failure that's keeping us from moving forward." Then he looked me straight in the eyes and said that I was that failure. I was stunned, paralyzed by the weight of his words. He explained that they felt their marriage would be perfect if it weren't for the burden of raising me. He said that they'd only had me because they hadn't had a choice, and that over the years, they'd grown to resent the role of being parents. My mom added that seeing me every day was a reminder of all the years they'd spent fighting, that I represented everything wrong in their lives. And now, they wanted a fresh start. They told me that they wanted me to move in with my grandparents. If my grandparents wouldn't take me, I'd have to find another solution, whether that meant staying with a friend or figuring things out on my own. I was numb. My heart was shattered. The people who had raised me, the only family I'd ever known, were casting me aside like a burden they no longer wanted to bear. My grandparents arrived to help me pack. My grandmother's face was filled with a fury I'd never seen before. She demanded to know how my parents could be so cruel, but they offered no remorse. My dad shrugged it off, saying that since my grandparents cared so much about me, it was only fitting they'd take me in. I packed my things, tears streaming down my face, holding on to a faint hope that my parents would change their minds. But as I turned to leave, they didn't even look up. They sat together, holding hands, ignoring me. At that moment, I understood that they had chosen each other over me. Moving in with my grandparents was both a relief and a painful adjustment. They were loving and supportive, doing everything they could to help me feel at home. But I was haunted by the trauma of being abandoned. I'd lie awake at night, unable to shake the nightmares and the crushing loneliness. I missed my parents, even though I knew they didn't miss me. Days turned into weeks, and slowly my grandparents helped me rebuild my life. My grandmother would make me breakfast every morning, complete with a smiley face of ketchup on my toast. My grandfather, always a stickler for neatness, ironed my school clothes with care, reminding me that I was worth the effort. I began participating in school activities and made friends, discovering the simple joys of being a teenager. 6 months passed. I was starting to find a sense of peace, though the pain of losing my parents still lingered. Then, out of nowhere, my phone rang, displaying a number I recognized immediately, my mom's. My heart pounded as I answered, bracing myself for whatever was coming. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, as she asked how I was doing. She said they wanted me to come back home, but something felt off. Her words were rehearsed, robotic, lacking any real emotion. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the pain they'd caused. Suspicious, I questioned her motives, and after some digging, the truth came out. They needed my signature to secure an inheritance from my paternal grandparents. Without it, the money would go to charity. When I confronted her, she tried to justify it, saying that the inheritance would benefit me, too. But I wasn't convinced. My maternal grandmother told her off, disowning her for her manipulation and cruelty. I blocked my parents' numbers and decided that I'd stay with my grandparents. They were the ones who'd shown me what real love and family meant. Today, I'm learning to accept that while my parents may never be the loving family I once hoped for, I have a new family in my grandparents, one that genuinely cares for me. It's not the life I envisioned, but it's a life where I am finally valued, and that is enough for me.